Now, of course, a person might say, well, that wouldn't be a god, that would be some sort of highly advanced alien that decided to create life here on Earth. Well, you can call it what you want, but it's a super being. It has the powers to qualify it as a god to those people. Remember the definition that we're using here. So it would be immortal, it would have all kinds of powers to bend reality, to the universe to its will. And I didn't say anything about the nature, the exact nature of God, or where God may or may not have come from. I don't know. But, God could be a very powerful alien. God could be some sort of spiritual creature. God could be some sort of uh, multi-dimensional life form which has evolved that far to exist on multiple dimensions all at once, which is how it can be omnipresent and how it can get around the universe so fast, and how it can twist the world in so many different facets and see into the future, be all-knowing and so forth. I'll give you one quick example of how it could be done. Let's say that evolution creates a race of super beings on one planet in one galaxy over there. Evolution also creates another race of super beings on a different planet in a different galaxy over there. What if both of these races evolve to the point where they exist on multi-dimensional levels? Is it possible to have a multi-dimensional life form? Are you possible? You are a multi-dimensional life form. You exist in the third dimension. You are a three-dimensional life form. So what if there was a seventh dimensional life form, for example? It would certainly be a creative way for evolution to get life into outer space. A multidimensional being that exists on a sufficiently high dimensional existence, time would not necessarily mean anything to such a being. So even though there was a point where it didn't exist, and now it does exist because it has been brought into existence, it now retroactively exists at all points in time from the beginning of time till the end of time. If that being exists on a sufficiently high dimensional level that it exists omnipresently, and it is omniscient, so it sees everything, it is everywhere all at once, it knows everything, and it can bend and shape the universe to anything it wants, then it would also be omnipotent. Now, what if there were lots of those beings? Billions from the one species and billions from the other species. Is it possible that evolution, once it reaches this exceedingly high dimensional level, it sort of conglomerates in a sense? Because you have to think that if these beings are omnipresent, then they would exist in the same space at the same time. They would be stacked on top of each other, so to speak. If this is the case, they would all be coexisting. Since they would all be omniscient, they would all know the absolute truth of the universe, since they all exist at all points in all times. Therefore, would it matter whether they are individuals or whether they all conglomerate together into some sort of super consciousness? Would that make a difference? If they all knew the absolute truth of the universe, it would be possible that they would all effectively be the same, because they would all come to the same conclusions about everything. Now, I'm digressing pretty hard, and I'm going to get back on track. And I'm not saying this is how things actually are. Just stay with me for a minute, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. So I hope that at this point I have managed to convince you that there are super beings out there in the universe, in all reality, in all probability, and if I were to be trying to argue one way or the other in whether such beings exist or don't exist, I would not want to be on the side of the argument trying to suggest that they don't exist, because it looks like, statistically, it would be very difficult to suggest that they don't. So, in all reality, there probably are super beings out there that would qualify as a god to the humans back from the biblical times if such a being were to interact with them. Alright, so we're already running long on this section of the video, this step, but there have been people who have reviewed this and have asked me a question that I think has a lot of merit, so I'm going to extend the segment even longer to explain that. The question is really just asking for more detail about how it would be possible for a spiritual being to come into existence. Before we can even begin answering this question, we have to consider what it exactly means to be a spiritual creature. So let's consider that. What does being spiritual really mean? It's difficult to describe because there would be so many different cultures that would have so many different answers to that. It would require for us to know more about the nature of the spirit, which seems to be an elusive subject. So instead, I'm simply going to describe how a being could exist in an immaterial nature. Ethereal, ghostly, it is invisible, in fact. You could not touch it with, you could not see it, you could not, use any of your five senses to detect it. It exists, but it is effectively intangible. Perhaps this being can become material and take on a physical form that we would understand, or perhaps it can't. Perhaps it has more or less power. That's not the point. We're only going to be talking about how a being could exist that is in fact immaterial. I will in fact describe 3 separate ways in which a being such as this could come into existence. Alright everybody, I'm going to ask you to put your math hats on for a minute, and let's talk about multi-dimensional levels of existence and what that would mean for a sentient being. Consider a mathematical formula, something that you can graph on a sheet of paper. And consider that there are certain things that you can plug into the formula. You must plug them in a certain way, and only certain types of things can be plugged into the formula. That's just how the formula is designed to be. And when you graph that out, there are only a certain amount of things that the graph can be made to do, because the formula is only so complex. So there's only a certain amount of different things that the graph, once you graph it, that it could look like. The more complex a formula becomes, the more you can do with it. So then the more things that the graph on paper could look like. It could look like more things. It could become more complex. Alright, now I'm going to need you to compare the universe to a math equation. On a lower dimensional level of existence, there is less that is possible in the universe because the formula is less complex. On a higher dimensional level, what is possible in the universe is greater. There are more things that would be considered possible, that could happen in the universe, because the universe would be more complex as you continue to look at the universe in a more integrated way. And when I say integrated, I mean that in a mathematical sense. I mean, well, I'm stepping up to a calculus level of math at this point, and throwing some physics in there. At a higher dimensional level of existence for the universe, its equation that represents what the universe is, what it can do, is much, much more complicated on a higher dimensional level. This would be like looking at an equation with a function of x with a much higher level of integration, as opposed to drive the equation further and further and further down, making it more simplistic. Now let's consider that in order for life to exist, the following criteria must be met: A, B, C, D, and E. Alright. On a lower dimensional level, things are less complex. So it is more difficult, or we could say less likely, for A, B, C, D, and E to all actually happen. But on a higher dimensional level, the universe is more complex. The equation is more complex. So it is more likely and much easier for the equation to happen to stumble across the criteria A, B, C, D, and E all happening in this higher dimensional level. So it actually makes much more sense mathematically for life to start at a much higher dimensional level and then filter down from that. This lends credit to the concept of a very powerful, high-level, multidimensional being, this God being, and it exists, and then further lower dimensional levels of existence come from it. To use a mathematical term, you could say that other forms of life that are in lower dimensional levels are derived from the higher level. I know that a lot of people are going to look at that and say, wait, you're suggesting that evolution starts at the top with the most complicated stuff and then makes less complicated things? That doesn't seem like that makes sense. That goes the opposite direction. But no, that's not what I'm saying exactly. I would suggest that if we are still going for the evolutionary thought, evolution still starts, like on our dimension, small and simpler, and then steps up the complexity from there. But in terms of whether life would start sooner or easier on a first dimensional level, and then move up to a second dimensional level, and then move up to a third dimensional level, and then a fourth dimensional level, that's probably not how it would happen. It would actually be far more likely for it to start off at a very high level, a top level, if there is such a thing. Then it would start very high and then progress downward to lower dimensional levels, rather than starting at a low dimensional level and then stepping up to higher dimensional levels. Now let me talk about that for a minute though, because we think, well, which way is it easier to go? Well, if we look at how life could exist if we stepped up even one dimensional level of existence to a fourth dimensional being, well, the universe would be so much more complex, there'd be so much more that you can do, that it would be far more possible for life to exist in such a capacity. Possibly, maybe not in all of space, but in much, much more of space than what it seems like life is able to exist in as of right now, as far as our planet is concerned.